Welcome, everyone, to the first virtual Tisch College Civic Lunch of the fall semester. Today's conversation will focus on climate change, global challenges, global solutions. I'm Alan Solomont, Dean of the Tisch College of Civic Life, and it is my pleasure to kick off today's program featuring Dean Rachel Kyte and Tina Wilston. Tisch College has many upcoming events this fall, all virtual. Next week, we are hosting PBS White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor on Tuesday, Boston Mayor Marty Walsh on Wednesday, former Green Jobs advisor to President Obama, host of the Redemption Project and CNN commentator Van Jones on Thursday, and on Friday, conservative political strategist Scott Jennings will appear alongside progressive political strategist Robbie Mook for an analysis of the first presidential debate of 2020, which will take place next week. You can find more information and register for any or all of those events at tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. Today, we are pleased to host Dean Rachel Kyte, Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, for a conversation about climate change. We know this will interest the entire Tufts community, but especially undergraduates, who will soon get to know Dean Kyte and what a fierce champion she is for protecting our planet from climate change. Tisch College and the Fletcher School have a strong partnership, and we are grateful for their collaboration on events such as this, as well as programs like the Tisch Summer Fellows, the Tisch Fund for Civic Engagement, and the joint faculty appointment held by Professor Alnor Ibrahim. Before I hand it over to Sabrina Andrews to introduce our guests, I want to remind our audience that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of our speakers during today's conversation. If you have a question, please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time. Tisch staff will be in touch with you directly for additional instruction, and we will do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. And now I am pleased to hand things over to second-year Fletcher student leader, and environmentalist Sabrina Andrews to introduce our guests. Sabrina?
Great. Thank you, Dean Solomont, for those kind words. Welcome, everyone, to today's Civic Life Lunch conversation with Dean Rachel Kyte and Tina Wilston. My name is Sabrina Andrews, and I'm a second-year master's student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. I'm studying international environment and resource policy and development economics. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dean Rachel Kyte and Tina Wilston. A 2002 graduate of Fletcher's Global Master of Arts program and a professor of practice at Fletcher since 2012, Dean Kyte has been a longtime supporter of Tufts and the Fletcher School, which is the nation's oldest graduate-only school of international affairs. In 2019, she became the first woman to lead Fletcher as dean. Prior to joining Fletcher, Kyte served as special representative of the UN Secretary General and CEO of Sustainable Energy for All. In her UN role and as CEO of SE for All, Kyte led efforts to promote and finance clean, affordable energy and low carbon growth as part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the Paris Agreement. She grew SE for All into an organization that employs more than 40 staff and has partnerships with companies, governments, and civil society organizations. She continues to serve as co-chair of UN Energy. And before that, she was the World Bank Group Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change, leading the Bank Group's efforts to shift its operations and campaign for the Paris Agreement. Joining Dean Kyte in conversation today is Tina Wilston, the Director of the Office of Sustainability here at Tufts. Tina Wilston, a lead Green Associate, has been the Director of the Office of Sustainability at Tufts since 2010. She first joined the office in 2007 as the project coordinator, focusing on outreach and education. She works with senior administrators and departments across Tufts to develop and support Tufts sustainability goals and efforts, ranging from transportation to carbon neutrality planning, sustainable living communities, and new student and employee orientations. While at Tufts, she has created peer-to-peer and general education programs for students and employees. The Green Fund for on-campus community-led projects, courses focus on action for sustainability, and facilitated President Monaco's 2011 University-wide Sustainability Council that developed goals and recommendations for the university in the areas of water, waste, energy, and emissions. She expanded the office and created a robust student internship program that works on recycling education and outreach, composting, co-curricular education, sustainability communications, and tracks Tufts' progress towards sustainability and carbon neutrality, among other things. Prior to coming to Tufts, Tina directed the sustainability program at Earthwatch Institute and co-founded her town's Climate Action Committee. She was one of the first 1,000 people to be trained by Al Gore as part of the Climate Reality Project. She holds a BS and MS in animal science and ruminant nutrition from Cornell and a certificate in community environmental education from the Urban Environmental Policy and Planning Department. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dean Rachel Kyte and Tina Wilston.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, and thank you, Alan Solomon and Jess Burns, who also helped organize this event. I'm really thrilled to be here today because, as you mentioned, I've been working on sustainability at Tufts for a very long time. So when I heard Dean Kyte was coming, I did a little dance. I'm so excited to have another strong climate advocate with us here at Tufts. So there's so many things I want to ask Dean Kyte about. So I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is, Dean Kyte, what gets you up in the morning?
Well, hey, Tina, thanks very much. And to Sabrina, thank you. Sabrina's one of the reasons why I came to the job, because anything I can do to help people like Sabrina ready themselves for a huge challenge of global leadership going forward, then that's where I want to be, and that's what I want to be doing for the next few years. So what gets me up in the morning, apart from my Australian Labradoodle, Bruce, it is this sort of wicked problem that we have right at the moment, where we are pushing up against our boundary limits as a planet, but at the same, which is deeply terrifying, but at the same time we are reaching tipping points in the galvanization of action across the world that is going to be necessary in order to build a society that's decarbonized and more equal, or suffering less from inequality. And so I'm motivated in the morning both by a real dread about what the science is saying, but a real sort of hope that we do actually have the wherewithal to get ourselves organized to be able to rise to the challenge of what it would mean to organize ourselves differently going forward. So both a little bit of fear and a lot of hope.
And a little bit of dog.
And a dog, yeah.
So those are huge problems. They're what helps get me out of bed in the morning too. And just looking at your history, working for the UN and Sea for All seems like they could be one of the most impactful ways of making a difference on a global level, because you're able to work with and influence actors from around the world. What made you decide to leave all that and come to the Fletcher School?
Well, two things is that it became very clear to me in the work that I was doing that there is the way in which generations of the generations who are present here as undergraduates, the generations who are present at the Fletcher School as graduate students, that the type of leadership and the leadership complexity, or the challenges that people have to face, are enormous, and we're asking more of leaders now than ever before. And I wanted to be part of readying that generation for leadership earlier. And the other thing is, I felt very strongly that people have to get out of the way. You can't just hold on to the positions of power when the generations below you actually see the problems in a different way and see the solutions in a different way. So that was in my mind. The other part of it was that I believe in baton passing. And I'd been sort of on the international circuit for decades. I had more or less burnt out in the effort to sort of get to the Paris Agreement, and then had sort of not taken any time, but had gone into a different role, moving from the World Bank to the UN, and that was a big lift as well. And so I feel that you should pass the baton on. You can always pick up the baton again later, but pass the baton on and sort of mix up the leadership. And I was very happy to be able to give the baton to Damilo Loganbayi, who made her name running the National Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria, and she's taken on the mantle now for the next few years. And I think that that's when the 850 million people who don't have electricity today, clean or otherwise, are living in sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's important to have a sub-Saharan African woman as the champion for that issue.
Absolutely. Do you feel that now that you're at the Fletcher School in the role of the dean, will you steer the school in a different direction than it has been focused on in the past?
I'm not sure it's a different direction, but we're doubling down here in that there are a number of existential crises that cut across all the fields of study at Fletcher. So we're famously interdisciplinary. There's no economics department at Fletcher, no politics department at Fletcher. We have fields of study, and students and the faculty reach across those fields of study so that you can understand the world in 360 degrees, understand its complexity in 360 degrees. And what we face now for the next decades is a series of existential challenges which have to both inform and be interrogated from each of those fields of study. Climate change is one of them. Zoonotic pandemics is another, and I talked about that actually when I interviewed for the job, not ever expecting that COVID-19 would have the impact that it did. Nuclear proliferation is another, and understanding the threats that come from the cyber world in which we live now is another. So we have to be able to teach these things through each field of study. So now climate, which was traditionally understood as an energy issue, traditionally understood as a natural resource issue at Fletcher, is taught in that way. We have a climate policy lab. We have a very, very robust center on resource policy and energy and environment. But we also explore climate now from the perspective of international law, from the perspective of migration and human security, from the perspective of security and strategic studies, and that we're building that out. So you should be able to come to Fletcher and explore climate change's the questions that climate change makes us ask about every dimension of international affairs.
Wow. Now I'm going to have to enroll.
No, it's wildly exciting, let me tell you. I'm excited about the possibility of inquiry, but also the possibility to come forward with solutions, because what I can tell you from my last jobs is where you're running, and you're just trying to solve the problem of this negotiation. You're trying to solve the problem of this financial package or this bilateral treaty, etc. You don't have the time to step back and think about the blue sky. The UN is 75 years old this week. And at 75 years, it has coped and it has struggled to cope and has sort of limped along. And we will, for the course of this year, we'll be looking at the UN at 75 at the Fletcher School. But if you think about the future, there's a question of, do we need to sort of put scaffolding around the way in which we deal with these complex issues just so that we can keep limping forward? Or actually, is there room to actually redesign the international system? And I think that these international organizations rely on places like Fletcher to come in and do that blue sky thinking and say, okay, well, how would we design it? The UN was designed in a world at a time when many of the countries who now sit as members of the General Assembly didn't exist. They were colonized. They weren't free and independent nations. These nations are often the ones that suffer the most from climate change. So how do you change the table so that the right people are sitting there, the people who have a stake are sitting there, and that they have the voting rights and they have the access to the discussions that they should have? So these are big questions we can ask ourselves at the Fletcher School.
That parallels another question I was going to ask, which is that some say that climate's a grand symbol of the failure of global governance. So how might our institutions evolve to better manage global challenges? So related to that, like, what kind of thinking has been going on at Fletcher, or in your mind, about how to better address, like, what could replace the UN? Does the UN play the most important role, et cetera?
Well, so let me just talk a little bit about what happened this week, because this is a blockbuster week for climate diplomacy, blockbuster month in actual fact. So this week, well, so last week in the run up to the UN General Assembly, the European Union announced that its new climate target is that they will reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 over 1990 levels. That is by far the most ambitious climate goal of any political entity at that point. On Tuesday of this week, in the inaugural session of this year's General Assembly, President Xi Jinping of China announced that China fully intends to be a net zero economy. So net zero means that you're not putting any more emissions into the atmosphere than you're pulling out by 2060, with peak emissions expected by 2030. If you understand anything about Chinese diplomacy, you'll know that they have a proud history of under-promising and over-delivering. We now have two of the three biggest emitters in the world, the third being the United States in that troika, committing to a level of ambition which has never been seen before and which is appropriate to the size of the challenge. So that commitment from China is basically in and of itself cutting off about between a third and a half a degree of warming from the globe's entire warming sort of projection. Also, the amount of investment necessary for China to reach that target means that they will grow their economy by 5 percentage points of GDP in the next 10 years. They are making a wholesale bet on a decarbonized future and their ability to compete in that future. So these things are happening. Alongside that, you've got business after business after business making a commitment to reduce their emissions. More than 2,000 businesses globally, and these are international businesses, have committed to those kinds of targets. More than 1,000 have committed to detailed science-based targets. All of this is happening without the UN. The UN sort of encouraging, setting the platform, setting the sort of high-level target. But the UN, this is not happening with UN agency support. This is just happening because people can see that that's where the future direction of travel is. What the UN is very good at doing, I think, is bringing people together, and it has been insistent on the partnership between private sector and public sector. So, for example, for many years now, there's been more and more investors pulling away from investing in coal. And then the insurers started saying coal is uninsurable. This week, the first Asian insurance firm, the largest insurance company in Japan, said we will no longer insure coal. Well, when the insurers won't insure it, then there's no money coming into that. So what was the role of the UN there? The UN 2 years ago brought all of the insurers together very quietly and said, look, we need the insurers to be looking at this and seeing how you can be catching up and maybe even leading the way. So this is not understood as the traditional diplomacy of the UN, which is state actor to state actor. Over the last 20 years, the UN has seeded and brought forth all kinds of public-private partnerships. I ran one at Sustainable Energy for All, which really do actually sort of move the debate forward. And I think that that is not very well understood within the United States.
How do you feel that China's announcement will impact the United States?
Well, so I testified to US Congress yesterday to the Foreign Affairs Committee subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, Energy and Environment. And it was very interesting because the questioning fell into two camps. One was, very focused on the fact that China is the problem and that we've got, the sort of Cold War rhetoric around China. The other was from congressmen and women who were like deeply concerned that the US is missing out on an opportunity that comes from really committing to clean growth and more inclusive growth. And I thought that was interesting because often the rhetoric in Washington is the cost of climate change. Climate change is going to be something that threatens the economy. And that was the basis for which President Trump indicated that he wished the US to leave the Paris Climate Accord. In actual fact, this is now a race to the top. It's a race to the top, which clearly the EU and China are betting on being able to prosper in. And I think that we have to change that conversation in Washington. When you travel around the country, that conversation has begun to shift because through America's pledge, which is the mechanism for towns and cities and states and governors to commit to the Paris targets, even if Washington has indicated that it wants the United States to withdraw. Through America's pledge, you can see extraordinary things happening, but they could go at scale, and their impact could be scaled if the federal government would indicate that it was up for this race. This is a race that the United States can win. It has technology. It has an academy that can continue to see around the corners and provide solutions. It has a robust and innovative private sector, and it actually has the finance to be able to back this. And then I think finally, climate change is impacting the United States, and it's impacting the most vulnerable here more. And the most vulnerable are people living on coastlines and in deltas and in riverine basins. The vulnerable are people in areas where the extreme high heat is going to mean a cycle of fires that we have never seen before except for the last 2 years, and this is going to be the new normal. The vulnerable are communities of color that are living in areas where there is high degrees of methane pollution and pollution from the tail end of a fossil fuel economy. And the vulnerable are the poor that are living in urban areas who can't get access to clean air. And when those cities start to get hotter and hotter and we have heat island effects, we're going to have to take care of those people. Finally, the vulnerable are the rural poor, where agriculture and agricultural yields are going to be severely impacted by climate-induced weather variations. So this is a country that for its own sake needs to desperately take care of its people, and it's going to have to do that understanding that climate will ravage the country unless we combat it.
Besides the economic implications of falling behind, do you see the countries around other nations around the world putting other types of pressure on the United States to act? And if so, like, how would they do that?
Well, I think that in the negotiations, and I still participate. So I'm an advisor to this. I'm one of the Secretary General's climate advisors, and I think that the way that the rest of the world looks at the United States is a sort of a desperate hope that the US returns to the fray, that we become engaged again. But I think what's happened in the last couple of years is that if we're not going to come back into the fray, then the world's just moving on. So nobody's sort of sitting and waiting. At the same time, the ties and the relationships between cities in the United States and the international negotiations have deepened. So Mayor Walsh is very involved in C40, the Climate Cities Alliance, which is chaired by Eric Garcetti at the moment, of Los Angeles, and was chaired previously by the mayor of Paris. Governors are very involved at the state level. So Massachusetts is involved in conversations in the U2 platform, which is a commitment of regions to get to under 2 degrees, which is the Paris Agreement. So I think the rest of the world is, and of course global business is very involved in this. And just this week, bringing it all the way home, General Electric announced one day, very much targeted to the US investor, that they were getting out of coal. And the day before, they had announced with a big splash, especially in Europe, that GE has won the bid to work with Equinor, which is the Norwegian oil company, to basically build, I think it was the largest order for 250-meter tall wind turbines in the North Sea off the coast of Yorkshire at a place called Dogger Bank. And this is the future, right? These extraordinarily efficient wind turbines. And so GE, only 5 years ago, GE made news for buying Alstom, which was a coal-based energy company in France. And within 5 years, they're out of the coal business. They're going to eat the mistake that they made in buying Alstom. And the future for GE is building wind turbines in the North Sea. Imagine what happens when they'll be able to put those up in deep water just off the coast of Massachusetts.
I know. That's been a long time coming. So, as you mentioned, cities and states have been, taking a lot of action on their own. Tufts signed the "We Are Still In" pledge when Trump withdrew the U.S. from or attempted to withdraw the US from the climate agreement. Is there something that we should be doing that we're not? Like, you know, is there something that we're missing, or like states or cities should be doing that you haven't seen them do yet?
Well, I think this slightly changed a little bit now with COVID, because now the economy is shrinking in more than 180 countries in the world. We've got 100 million people who are going to be pushed back into poverty. And on some indicators of well-being, 25 years of progress has been wiped out in 25 weeks. So we are standing on the edge, or depending on where you are in the world, you are right in the middle of one of the most severe economic shocks that we've ever experienced in modern industrial history. So now attention is on recovery. And so that recovery has to be a recovery that puts us on a better pathway. And that better pathway is one where there is more equity within the economy, that we're doing better for more people, and that we're doing it without carbon, that we're decarbonizing at the same time. Now, for a lot of people, they think, oh, no, that's too difficult. We've just got to recover and then we can worry about being green. The good news is that and I think there's quite violent agreement actually amongst economists and amongst planners and amongst all of the organizations that we trust in the world to look at this, that some of the smartest things to do are things which will get you good quality local jobs now, will get you income growth now, and which will put you on a pathway to more sustainability down the line. So the International Energy Agency and the International Monetary Fund put together a sort of sustainable recovery plan dealing with the energy sector in the summer as a handy sort of guide for government. And basically they said the greatest sort of job-rich, immediate recovery, but also really good for the planet and really good for green growth, would be the amount of jobs that come from the deep refurbishment of buildings. So buildings account for a large amount of emissions in most industrialized countries, and they're going to have to be deeply refurbished. So the jobs there are in the new materials that we'll use. The jobs are there in new electricity systems, in local energy grids, in cladding and energy efficiency, in smart, digitalized sort of mechanisms for keeping heating and water use and everything to a minimum. So this is just going to grow and grow and grow. So I think, there's one. The second is improving the energy grid so that it's more resilient. Third is installing microgrids and mini grids and solar home systems, etc., so that we have more resilience, but also locally people are getting cleaner electricity cheaper. And then in transportation and the jobs that will come from building out a system where everybody can find multimodal transportation that doesn't depend on carbon. So these are really good jobs. And I haven't even talked about land restoration, or the fact that every community in Massachusetts, if we had community biodigesters, would be doing a lot to deal with food waste, which is the third biggest emitter if it were a country. Would be helping with the sustainability of the food system, which is also one of the systems we need to address. So there's lots of really good things that can be part of recovery, and which will put us on a meaningful path to decarbonisation by the middle of the century. There's no trade-off. We can recover green, and we will do better if we do.
So Van Jones, who Dean Solomon mentioned is going to be speaking later today. When Obama was elected, he was brought on for green jobs for all, and sort of was making this case at that time. And he didn't stay very long in the administration. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for, like, do you feel like it did take off? Like it has taken off since then, or if it hasn't, like, is it going to be, like, what would make it different now?
So I think the shovel-ready aspects of the recovery in 2008, 2009 were not very green, and there was, and the administration wobbled, and I think that was somewhat frustrating but understandable in 2008. It would be chopping off your nose to spite your face if we did it this time. The OECD looked at this and concluded that when well implemented, the green recovery components of rescue packages after the financial crisis in 2008 actually performed very, very well by the measure of immediate economic stimulus and by the measure of well-being and emissions reduction. So all the evidence is that you can actually do it. What's changed between 2008 and now? I think that climate change was still seen as sort of like an environmental agenda in 2008. It's now an absolutely fundamental economic and financial agenda. It's an agricultural, environmental, social agenda now. It's pervaded all aspects of economic development, and so I think that's changed. What hasn't changed is the power of incumbency and the inertia in systems. And so we are going up against an extremely well-financed, extremely well-organized lobby of a tail end of an era of carbon-intensive economic, actors that aren't going to let go easily, and who've done very well out of the system. We're still pumping fossil fuel subsidies into the economy at an extraordinary rate across the G7, across the G20. Those subsidies could be applied very differently if the goal is to make sure that vulnerable people have access to affordable energy, and if the goal is that we don't contaminate our air and imperil people's health, and we are actually competitive from an energy perspective. So that hasn't changed, that's still there, but I think the preponderance of opinion has changed, and it's very clear now that you can do very well by moving forward with a clean energy agenda, that in fact the economy will grow faster. And if you don't want to believe people like me, then look at the financial markets. And this is very interesting. 6 years ago this week, I was in the General Assembly Hall with Ban Ki-moon, and he called for political action. He called the heads of state together and said, we've got 1 year to go until Paris. You have to lead on this issue. And then it kicked off 12 months of extraordinary diplomacy to get the Paris Agreement in place. At that time, we had all of the financial actors together. We had all of the insurance CEOs together. All of the big banking CEOs were there. And in a meeting of them, we looked at where were we? And at that point, I think there was something like $54 billion worth of assets under management were actually divesting from fossil fuels. Well, if we fast forward 6 years, I think the current figure is well over 1,500 institutions who have more than $11 trillion. And that number is a few months old, so it's probably changed, right? More than $11 trillion of assets under management have explicitly divested from fossil fuels. That's a 22,000% increase in 6 years. Now, they're not doing this because it's charitable. They're doing it because they don't see how they can make any money in that tail end of the fossil fuel economy. And the final thing I'll tell you is that in certain jurisdictions in the world, not the United States, but certainly in the UK, in Europe and elsewhere, the central banks are starting to look at this as an issue of macroeconomic risk. If the financial sector of your country is heavily invested in carbon, and carbon's value is going to collapse over the next 10 years, then you have got a potential financial collapse on your hands, right? So in the UK, there's actually a committee of the central bank, of the Bank of England, that is looking at introducing for all British banks or banks that work out of the UK or are listed in the UK, that 80% of the value will have to report on its carbon exposure. As soon as that comes into place, you're going to have thousands and thousands of companies all around the world. Because who's in London? HSBC, Standard Chartered, Barclays, some of the biggest global banks in the world are there, and then of course Citi and JP Morgan, and they're all operating there as well. They, on 80% of the value of their book, they will have to report on the exposure to carbon. So immediately we will start to see inside the financial system that who's holding on to carbon, and that is an asset, that is something you don't want to have in your portfolio. When this starts to happen, this tipping point I'm talking to, things will start to accelerate. People will not want to be exposed to the tail end of that economy, which will present a new problem for the leaders that we're graduating at Fletcher, which is we will have to take care of the people who will lose out in that transition. There are always some that do, and they have to be retrained. Their economies will have to be helped in a transition towards cleaner energy. So that's coal mining communities, communities with large-scale oil refineries and things like that. We will have to take care of those so that the transition is just.
So every time there's a new technology, like for example, and maybe this is just a matter of we have more people now or more interconnectedness, but I'm sort of curious, like technology changes all the time. And so when we switch, to automobiles, like all the people involved in horses, there was a huge economy around horses, for example, around carriages and horses and things related to transportation. Like, is there something special about energy and the transition in the energy world that makes people more aware of the need to take care of those in the sort of dying fields versus in the past? Like there's always dying fields of, and so have we always taken care of, like, have we always paid so much attention to retraining people in fields that are going away?
Well, so the transition economics is not a new field, right? So I remember when the Iron Curtain came down in the late 80s, and the world created a European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And the purpose of that bank was to take state-owned enterprises that were polluting and often had completely inflated payrolls, right? Lots of people were employed, but with maybe not very much to do, and how to make those companies competitive, efficient, less polluting, better places to work. And so we actually know how to help dying industries or dying companies through a transition. And I think one of the points is that this is happening worldwide, and in other countries there are processes of dialogue between community leaders, community members, unions, government, state and local and national, and other actors who can come in and, it's about what do we want our community to look like. So if there will be no more tar sands, what should Alberta look like? If there is to be no more coal, what should West Virginia look like? Now, in Alberta, there is a very sophisticated process of multi-stakeholder engagement looking at that. That is not true in West Virginia, except for the valiant work that's been done by some NGOs and faith-based groups and everything, because in this country, we're still sort of in denial that this transition is underway. So how do you have that transitional conversation in Indonesia? How do you have that transitional conversation in Angola? How do you have that transitional conversation in Vietnam? Heavily energy intensive, heavily fossil fuel dependent economies. That's where the conversation is at the moment. So yes, we've always had transition. My father worked for the publicly owned electricity utility in the United Kingdom at the time of the mining strike. And at the end of the miners' strike, the mining industry was basically closed down in the UK. And that led to the privatization of the steel industry and then to the privatization of the electricity supply industry. And some of that privatization was pretty crude. It was a first wave of privatization. It didn't work. And eventually my father was made redundant along with thousands of others, right? He was offered very little support. There was no transitional support. But if that were to happen again, we know a lot more about how to do that better. So I actually have personal empathy with what it means to be a victim of a transition. But there is a lot that we can do to help those communities find a pathway forward. I think what's harder is the question of identity. If you're a coal miner, that was a proud role that you played in your community. It was a proud job. It was a skilled job. And when you take those kinds of jobs away in a community, then individuals lose their identity as well as the community. And so we have to work hard, but the transition is already underway. And so we should be doubling down our efforts to build those transition pathways rather than sort of denying that the transition is going to happen.
It does sound, sounds like we've, as a society, have just grown more sophisticated. Like we've learned from past transitions, like what needs to happen for future transitions. And that gives me a lot of hope for people's ability to do so for this transition.
Well, the other thing is that the energy system that we had didn't work very well for a lot of people. I mean, most countries have 40% transmission losses, which means that 40% of the energy that goes into the wires never comes out the other end. We had 1 billion people who don't have access to any form of energy at all. And there's about 2.5, 3 billion people don't have access to reliable energy. Well, it's very difficult to start a business and grow a business if the energy cuts out 22 times a year. About 2.5 years ago, I was in Niger, and there was one hospital in Niamey, just on the outskirts of Niamey, that provides surgery and treatment for women who have fistula issues. So this is a problem that happens for young women in childbirth, and it's a really horrendous illness that can be treated. This is one hospital for 1,000 miles that actually would treat obstetric fistula. So people are walking, they're coming from, and there was no electricity that was reliable. The electricity was cutting out about 22 times a day. So that meant that, all of the things that you need, the autoclaves, the lighting, whatever. So, I mean, one question is, training the doctors to work in that hospital. The other is funding that hospital. The other is getting it a reliable electricity supply. But nobody had put a microgrid or had made put solar panels up on that hospital so that it could operate effectively. So we have to remember that the electricity system that we had today served certain people very well, but did a very poor job at actually serving a lot of people reasonably well. And there's no reason why we can't have more resilient, more affordable, more reliable, and more power going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is time to move on to audience questions. So just a reminder, please identify yourself, ask one brief question, it has to be a question, not a comment. And I think we have our first person right now. It's Brian Larson.
Hi, Tina. Thanks so much for helping to moderate. Hi, Dean Kyte. My name is Brian Larson. I am a second year MIB student at the Fletcher School. Thanks so much for putting on this wonderful discussion. We're very fortunate to have Dean Kyte at the Fletcher School. My question is, you mentioned that, for Dean Kyte, you mentioned that at the beginning of the talk, you discussed zoonotic diseases during the process of becoming Dean. And I'm wondering, how did your time at the World Bank and UN prepare you to navigate some of the early decisions you made at Fletcher regarding the pandemic?
Well, so a couple of things. First of all, I mean, there's a big teachable moment about the fact that the world was warned in precise detail of the risk of a pandemic, a zoonotic pandemic. So after SARS, after MERS, and then after Ebola, the World Bank and WHO set up something called the Global Monitoring Board, chaired by the former head of the International Confederation of the Red Cross and one of my former bosses, Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway, former Director General of the World Health Organization. And they came out with their first annual report in September, like this time, literally this week last year. And in their executive summary, they describe COVID-19 in precise detail, a virulent, respiratory, airborne, or whatever, a zoonotic disease, and say we are not prepared. Every country should do, and gives every country a sort of laundry list of things that they're supposed to do. Well, that obviously sat on the shelves in various places and didn't get acted upon. So we were warned, and this was a danger in plain sight. When I was at the World Bank, I was in management at IFC when SARS broke out. And then when I was at the World Bank, I was the vice president responsible for the zoonotic disease unit, which sat between our agriculture practice and our environment practice and the health practice. And what was interesting about that was the impacts that these kind of shocks can have on the economy. So what these shocks can do to food prices. So a lot of my work at that point was just sort of understanding that you need to act really quickly and you need to be able to get emergency funds to governments really quickly. So, there's no reason why you can't come up with a program, get the political support and get it through the board of the World Bank in 90 days, that kind of thing. And we did do that at that point. I think what I also learned is that when you're doing business continuity, there are things that you control and then there are things you don't control. So for example, we can build a plan for Fletcher to go remote, but I can't control whether Zoom's going to work, right? I hope that Verizon doesn't crash. And in fact, when we did the business continuity planning, well, that was after 9/11, and then after when we had to sort of imagine biohazards and whether we had to rest, we did business continuity planning if the world had to rest in place because of a biohazard attack on Washington, that kind of thing. You started to get a very, very good inventory about what assets were under your control and what assets you were dependent on that were beyond your control, and then you had to plan for both sort of scenarios. So when we had to close down in March, and I realized in late February we were probably going to have to do that, I was just able to sort of bring together a control room, bringing everybody together at Fletcher. And of course, the Fletcher Military Fellows played a very important role in supporting active decision-making at the university. So, not being afraid to make a decision, I think, is also the other thing. When people have clarity, they can mentally prepare for that new world. We made an early decision to only be remote. We took some criticism at the time. In retrospect, it was the right decision.
Thank you.
For so many reasons. Thank you, Brian. David James.
Thank you so much, Dean Kyte, for your excellent presentation. I'm David James, Fletcher GMAP graduate from 2005, and I work with the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology Graduate University in Okinawa, Japan. My question is, how can the US-Japan relationship play a role in climate change action?
Well, so that's a really great question. So So it's been very interesting the last sort of decade of climate action, where climate diplomacy has sort of become much more significant, in that there have been changes in norms both in the US and in Japan, right? And meanwhile, the science has marched forward. And so I think what's been complicating from a Japanese perspective has been the shift in both social attitudes and the shift in government thinking after the tsunami in 2011, and the fact that there was a reappraisal of the role of nuclear and a reach back to coal at that point. And that was, that's obviously had very complicated history within Japanese politics and within Japanese society. And it's also hamstrung Japan as they've thought about, how do they show up in the world in terms of exports and their role in supporting, especially in Southeast Asia, but then more broadly, infrastructure development. And you've seen the Japan JICA and the Japan Bank for Investment wrapped into JICA, really struggling with the fact that you've got sort of reasonably robust but a little bit platitudinous statements coming out from the Japanese government about what its climate ambition is. Meanwhile, Japan desperately trying to sell coal technology to Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, and then a little bit further beyond, competing with China, who through the Belt and Road Initiative have been investing heavily in infrastructure around the world. And the vast majority of that first wave of investment in Belt and Road has not been green, so it hasn't been renewable energy. And so this need for competition has meant that they've been competing with technologies which really aren't going to serve the countries in which these will appear, very well. And so, under the Obama administration, there was very intense pressure on Japan, Korea, and everyone to stop the financing of coal overseas. That immediately disappeared in 2016 with the advent of this administration. And you sort of saw that lack of US pressure, especially in Japan, give them a little bit of breathing room, because that was a very intense debate. Now it's intensified again now with new personalities coming through the LDP. You've now got a young and charismatic Minister of Environment, Koizumi-san, who's pushing on this, but the Ministry of Environment is by far not the most powerful ministry in Japan. This is really, Ministry of METI, Ministry of Transport Industry, as you know, and then Ministry of Finance. And so there's a real battle royal going on. It'll be interesting to see, with Abe stepping down, whether we have the continuation of a sort of cautious approach by Abe's successor, or whether or not Japan will seize this moment. And with China and the EU coming out with these aggressive targets now, even though the details are not clear, does that give permission within Japan to sort of join the race to the top? Korea has also come out with a green recovery plan, for example, in July, which has I think a 60 billion or more investment in renewable energy, a commitment to create 700,000 new jobs in clean energy and transport. But there's also a big bung that they've been given to a couple of the big conglomerates in South Korea to continue with the manufacturing of coal technology overseas, and a couple of big deals that have just gone down. Those deals are white elephants. They will not produce a return, but you still got a bit of hesitation. So it will be interesting to see what happens in November. Interesting to see where this relationship continues. But I think that the pressure on Japan to compete where it really can compete, which is on energy efficiency, on technology, will be important. There's even more to say about green hydrogen and the role that Japan plays in some other technology, innovation, and investment conversations. But I don't think we've got time for that today.
Great. Yeah, I'd like to hear from Patty Kloss.
Good afternoon, Dean Kyte. I'm Patty Kloss, Director of Dining Services. We all work right here for the university on campus.
Thank you for all you do.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your references to the food system. So many we're so committed to the changes we could make. But here's my question. What is the single most effective thing everyone could do today to reduce carbon emissions of the foods they choose?
So first, I just want to caveat my answer with the fact that there is a huge issue around the affordability of healthy food in this country. The food system is broken, and we have to fix the food system so that we solve for affordability, we solve for a healthy diet, and we solve for a healthy diet that is sustainable. This is not impossible to do. But aren't we lucky at Tufts that we have the Friedman School, we have Fletcher, we have us? We can solve this, and perhaps we can become a model for it. And you're going to see more and more amazing research and collaboration between Friedman and Fletcher around this problem set. But the most important thing you should do is, within whatever budget you have, whether we're talking about the institutional budget or your individual budget, is only buy the food that you need. Don't throw food away. The amount of food that we waste from market to fork in the developed world is an extraordinary waste of resources, an extraordinary contribution to emissions. So if we can just cut food waste. Now, of course, in the developing world, most of the waste is between the farm and the market, because we don't have cool technologies, we don't have ways to transport food, and you have other things getting in the way. But in the developed world, it is between the market and the fork. And so the most important thing you should do is not throw food away. Don't buy too much, put it in the refrigerator and see it rot. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the single most. There is a whole host of other things, but if we all did that, we would make a difference.
Great, thank you. There's Daniel Zakin.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for speaking, Dean Kyte. My name's Dan Zakin. I am a undergraduate student and a leader of the Sunrise Movement at Tufts, a nationwide youth movement fighting for a Green New Deal, good jobs, and a livable future. And I really appreciate your comments about redesigning international systems and ensuring a just transition. My question is about our global economic systems. The climate crisis is directly caused by our highly extractive system of global capitalism. And you've touched on this a little bit earlier, but can we mitigate the crisis without fundamentally dismantling this form of capitalism that's caused it? And if so, can you describe broadly what the first major steps must be?
Okay, well, so first of all, hats off to the Sunrise Movement and hats off to you. And you should be giving the seminar and I should be sitting in the background, you know, with emojis and things like that. So I just want to say respect. So actually, part of my writing at the moment and part of my work at the moment is this. I've conceived of it as sort of scaffolding and scholarship. So scaffolding, we've got to do certain things to keep the international system working, because if it collapses, it could do more harm. But while we're doing that, we actually have to redesign the new systems. We need the scholarship on what the new system. So what do I mean? So more than 90 countries have gone to the IMF in crisis at the moment because of the economic impacts of the COVID crisis. They need to come back and they need to be able to use this moment to pivot so that they can have more inclusive and greener pathways forward. The IMF can barely cope and doesn't have the resources to be able to do that. These are countries that are highly indebted, and what the world seems to be suggesting is that they should become more indebted in order to come out of a crisis, and they will not be resilient to the next crisis, which is climate. So, so part of the sort of scaffolding is what are we going to do about that, and can we just get more resources into the IMF so that they can distribute more resources out the door? The second, and in that there may be some tweaking that you can do. So, for example, can you constrain the amount of public resources that then go into supporting what I would call zombie industries? So industries that are not going to be competitive, nor are going to be good employers over 10 years. But then you've got to help those countries with another package so that you're not sort of putting people out of work because you're closing down their fossil-based economy, right? So what does that look like? Is there such a thing as green conditionality, and can it work? Question mark. Meanwhile, the redesign is, can we actually solve for indebtedness and solve for the climate at the same time? Could you do a generation of climate debt swaps so that you actually write off the debt in return for a pathway of green stewardship? Is there a way to actually invest in the soils and forests of the developing world in a way that is not exploitative, in a way that isn't a sort of upholding of a series of sort of global companies that just want to offset? So can we imagine what a next generation of offsets that truly are equitable looks like? But at the core of the economic system, we have a measure of progress and a measure of success, which was never supposed to be that. So GDP was never envisaged to be the rubric of thumbs up, thumbs down. And in fact, Simon Kuznets, when he first put it forward, said, do not use this in this way. And we sort of, through the Bretton Woods institution process in the late 40s, ignored all of that. And now we have this measure of success, which neither internalizes the impact that we have on the environment, nor does it value social care, nor does it value investment in healthcare and education and social care. And so we will have to put in place, alongside eventually, I think, replacing GDP with something else. Now, there's been lots of work done on natural capital, human capital, happiness indices. You've got the governments of Finland, of New Zealand, of Costa Rica, and elsewhere building well-being budgets. We are going to have some measure of value and success in society and economic performance, which is about the well-being of the planet and the well-being of society. Those conversations have picked up again. These conversations are happening in the margins of the UN. They're happening in the IMF. They're happening at the Bank of International Settlements and elsewhere. So this conversation is starting to get, but I mean, what I've called for is a new Bretton Woods moment, a new reset. I think the question then is, who sits around the table? mean, traditionally, if you're talking about debt write-off, the people who sit at the table are the developing countries who are indebted, the sovereign lenders, the OECD countries that have lent the money in the first place and could actually write off the debt, and then maybe some of the big financial houses who are working, who've extended resources as well. But today, if we were going to have a table that would reset that, you would have to have countries there, you would have to have China there, you'd have to have India there, you would have to have banks there, but you'd have to have private equity there. And who else should be at the table if we're going to sort of press a reset button? So I think these are very real design issues. They are alive. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for movements like Sunrise that understand the intersectionality of inequity, to just keep doing what you're doing and keep pushing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So at this point, we are out of time. I wanted to thank Dean Kyte and Dean Solomon and Sabrina for organizing this event today and participating. And I want to thank everyone else who's participating on YouTube and within this Zoom room with us today. And I personally want to thank Dean Kyte. I feel like this has been a really inspiring conversation. When you're sort of buried in the details of the work, it can get disheartening, but it's really nice to hear about so much work by so many people all over the world that's really big and really impactful. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tina. And for those of you who had questions in the chat room or on the side, if you want to contact me, I'm happy to try to answer them bilaterally. But we're talking about system change, we're talking about big ideas, but we're also talking about the individual actions that we each take, and they do add up. And so if you have choice, make the bold and the exciting choice, and find allies and build movements, and things can change, and you would be surprised by how quickly things can change sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you.